Modern monetary theory often says that there is a need for a government deficit to create the assets of the private economy. So the only way that the private economy as a whole can save, meaning it builds up monetary assets, is if the state is indebting itself, so running a deficit. And in terms of aggregate demand, more important than who has what assets, that if the private economy as a whole is saving, this means it's the job of the government to always run a deficit to prevent that desire to save on the part of the private sector from diminishing aggregate demand. But this is really a question of the dynamic of the private economy, if this is actually necessary. Let's just say above this line are savings, and below it are borrowings. And the dynamic of the private sector is always the balance between the savings being made. So let's restrict ourselves to the business sector. The dynamic of the business sector are the profits being made, so what's being saved out of income. So the profits are their savings, business savings, what they don't have to pay back to their contractual obligations like workers' wages, other inputs, etc. So on the one hand, you have whatever group of businesses that together are saving. And so the question is, do you have an equivalent monetary amounts being borrowed by businesses that cancels that out? This cancels this out. And the dynamic is that, well, all these savings are being made because these businesses before themselves borrowed to make an investment. They borrowed a large amount, perhaps even leveraging some of their existing assets, savings, and spent that to make some investment to gain some absolute advantage which they're now enjoying in bringing in these profits. And so you've got to remember the fact that now, in whatever time period we're talking about now, there's these savings, meant that before this, these same businesses were borrowing. So they were adding expenditure to the economy. And the fact that these ones were previously adding that expenditure, creating demand for the products of all sorts of products of other businesses, is the reason why these businesses now are borrowing, because they're reacting to that previous injection of monetary demand by borrowing to expand their own capacity to meet that, what they see as this higher demand. So the dynamic is this continuous expectation of some sort of growth. Of course, one business that's much smaller than another business, they've all got their own individual markets they're reacting to. But in aggregate, you've got the fact that is being saved is compensated for by the fact that those savings are made because there was a previous investment, which was demand for someone else's, which is then in turn going to make them invest. So the question is it possible for a business dynamic to emerge that carries itself? And this is the idea of the business cycle, that probably no, at some point, because of the tendency to build up overcapacities, so that there will eventually be a contraction because enough businesses see that they've overinvested in their capacity, so they draw down on costs. They see because of too much optimism about this trajectory, the business cycle improving, all this investment is made, money is borrowed to build capacity that isn't then demanded, and so businesses will save even more. Because, for example, the investment they made was to increase worker productivity, so with the same amount of workers they could produce more output, but then if that the expected demand to buy that increased output isn't realized, then the answer, of course, is to fire workers. That you can produce if you're not producing a higher output with the same workers, you produce a lower output with less workers, or the same output with less workers. And so the scales tip, and you could get, instead of a upward spiral where more is being borrowed than saved, more is being saved than borrowed. And this sort of just goes down and down and down. And there's various ideas about what the sort of natural limit of that is when things start to recover. But the point is, the government, by deficit spending, can intervene to create the demand that was expected to continue this, to keep this dynamic going. This is probably, and so the question is, how could this dynamic be kept without fiscal intervention by the state? And the idea is always monetary policy. You could, with wise monetary policy, relaxing at the right moment, and not, probably more importantly, not being too restrictive too early, allowing a bit of potential inflation, which will then take care of itself because it's increasing capacity. So with the right relaxed monetary policy, with cheap credit, you could potentially keep this dynamic going without ever needing any fiscal intervention. Whether that's possible is probably a hypothetical, because the other reasons for fiscal intervention in terms of microeconomic reasons, so instead of taking care of this macroeconomic situation of savings and borrowings never always cancelling each other out, or borrowings being more than savings so that there's a growth dynamic, there's that microeconomic aspect we're talking about. Whether that's possible without fiscal intervention is hypothetical, because probably before then, even if we could get really good monetary policy to keep the dynamic very good, we'd never know if there was a point where fiscal intervention would be necessary to keep that macroeconomic dynamic going, because you'd always need fiscal activity beforehand for microeconomic reasons, to build certain infrastructure that's needed, all sorts of things that without which the private economy wouldn't function for microeconomic reasons. You know, the necessary infrastructure for the population growth, etc., etc. So the question is more, how could the dynamic be improved? And I think there's a lot of promise relying in a better use of monetary policy. So for example, the idea of never restricting on the prediction of inflation, because this is something MMT talks about, a hard limit versus a soft limit, you know. So actually you can deficit spend because there is no hard budgetary limit. You could deficit spend and it's not going to be inflationary. But at some point, the additional monetary demand on real resources will be inflationary, because there is a hard physical limit to the real resources. And so I read something saying, well, so that's the part you need to counterfinance with tax. You know, maybe the hard limit is actually a $20 billion deficit. So beyond that, you need a tax finance. But the whole problem is you can't know that in advance. You have no idea what the effects are going to be. And so you can't, you know, the sort of government budget is an ex post thing that you can try and balance at the end, you know, after an arbitrary cycle, a period of time like a year. So the point is, the fact that you're noticing the deficit spending is actually causing inflation, or there is inflation, whether or not that spending is actually, you could say, the cause of it. The point is, the solution to that inflation is then pulling money out of the system. So then you increase taxes in response to that. The idea that in any ex-ante sense, beforehand, you can say, well, this is beyond the hard limit of deficit spending, so we've got to tax that, it's impossible. You can't know that in advance. You have to wait for the inflationary effects to take effect. And it's the same with monetary policy. You can't know in advance when too relaxed monetary policy is causing private dynamic to hit up against the limits of the system and create inflation. Because, again, since all these statistics aggregate aggregates you're dealing with are just a sort of an arbitrary time frame, like within a year. For example, our inflationary target is 2% a year or whatever. You could have one part of the year that's higher and one part of the year that's lower, which could be fine because those are adjustments of relative prices. For example, the fact that necessary investments were made, which first put a bit of strain on prices, but then increased capacity and those prices went back down. And so there was no long-term issue with inflation. And so you've got to have a real competent approach to allowing a bit of potential or inflationary potential, so actual statistical inflation that is actually only changes in relative prices. You've got to have a real capacity to distinguish the effect of these relative price changes in the aggregate inflation statistic from real inflationary developments that are going to take off unless you restrict monetary policy. So that's one side of it. The other side is, of course, when MMT says there's a tendency for the private sector to save, it's not just talking about the business sector. There's also the household sector. And so, while here I've had so this is businesses cancelling each other out, let's say, or maybe even borrowing a bit more if there's a growth dynamic. The point is, households could also be saving a lot out of their income. And so this means if we're saying the government, we're exploring the possibility of the government not needing to deficit spend to keep this macroeconomic dynamic going, then of course businesses have to, by this amount, have to borrow that much more. But the point is, why would they borrow that much more when these household savings are being withdrawn from income? The demand for companies' products that isn't being realized, or potential demand that's being saved for later instead of spent now on business products, so the businesses aren't getting any demand signal, I'm going to borrow money to invest to meet this higher demand. So you've got a problem here. Here again, there's a aspect of dynamic because you've got the absolute amount of money being saved out of, let's say, household or worker wages, but you've also got the rate of savings. And the point is, if the economy is growing and so the rate's staying the same, what's being saved out of incomes, out of wages, and so just the absolute amounts being increased, that is already somewhat balanced by the fact that the only reason those workers are having increases to their real wages, or to their nominal wages, but also to their real wages, so that they can save a higher amount, absolutely, is because money was spent in the first place. So just like these business profits are there because earlier was invested, these household savings are there because earlier was spent, money was spent, which employs them. But in the end, both of them add up together as the savings being withdrawn from the system that the the business borrowing has to counter. Well, private sector borrowing, because that's the other thing. This is the question. The other thing that needs to be balanced, to got right, apart from monetary policy, is the transfer system. So, for example, if houses are saving, well, it could be that households are equally borrowing, for example, to buy houses for mortgages. So that actually this represents more of a transfer system macroeconomically, and there's no problem here. So this is just sort of self-contained within the banking system, handling, allowing some households to save to fund the other households' mortgages. And it's the same sort of in question with other savings for insurance or things like this. But then this becomes an institutional question. And for example, this has become big recently with all this push for private savings, because the pension system is supposedly unsustainable, which is nonsense, because the pension system is just a transfer system. You know, all the money that's in countries where the workers actually pay out social contributions in their wages, those are then spent by the pensioners. There's no saving. or if it's just done through general taxation, the government taxes and the pensions receive social security payments, which they spend. And so then if the government taxation and spending is balanced, then you've got just a transfer system. And so it shouldn't be encouraged for the idea that additional private saving is necessary, because the only solution to this problem is higher productivity. Either way, whether it's taxes that have to be paid by the workforce or contributions, social security contributions out of their wages, or when there's private saving being encouraged, like portfolios and such of shares, it's increased income from businesses that have to go to pay those dividends. But all this is just coming out of the same GDP. It doesn't change anything. The only way, one of it's more obvious, because this is the problem if you're a worker and you see to pay the pensions of an increasingly aged population, a higher and higher proportion of your income has to be, you have to pay out, or high, either in taxes or direct contributions. You start to think, this aging's a problem because I'm having to pay out a bigger amount of my income. But whether this is sustainable or not depends entirely on productivity development, how much the absolute income actually is. If over the next 20 years growth is amazing and people get hugely richer in real terms, a bigger proportion of that having to be paid by the smaller workforce to pay for the pensionees isn't going to be a problem. So it depends, you're putting this strain on either a stagnating system or a very well-running system. And that's the difference. And so it all comes down to these institutional factors. Even with something like Australia, the super system, how that's institutionally built in terms of if it's actually ensuring that those savings are being spent on investment, and spent is the point, and not just building up as financial assets, that makes the difference. So the two big things to maintaining this private sector dynamic and minimizing the macroeconomic role for fiscal policy is good monetary policy and a rethinking of the saving fetish we have in society. So really educating the public about what savings actually mean, that macroeconomically you can't have savings, and that what we really want is everything to function like a transfer system. And so you could potentially have completely different institutional settings where mortgages were, just the fact that a population is more full of renters versus homeowners obviously has an effect. Although then, depending on who's making all the profits from renting, they could cause a bigger problem with just saving all those profits. You could also have a completely different finance system other than mortgages. You could not have the need for such large deposits to be made initially, so that all the payments of the mortgage are just out of running income.